Greetings, my brothers and sisters. Sending gratitude to all of you who are joining in today to accompany us down the rabbit hole of self-exploration through plant medicines. My name is Ryan Sprague, and I'm here to tell you that your frequency is now set and tuned to explore psychedelic medicines and the impact they've made among the countless psychonauts exploring the last true frontier. Buy a ticket and take the ride with me as we get true first-hand accounts of the experiences, benefits, risks, and transformations taking place within the ever-expanding world of psychedelic medicines on This One Time on Psychedelics. I began this show in 2021 to discuss the experiences others were having within the realm of psychedelics, in order to illuminate for those seekers curious about this realm the many possibilities that exist within it. During the time I have been running the show, I have had the opportunity to hear some truly incredible stories. However, I feel today's episode is one of the best examples of the wild and supernatural occurrences that are possible for all of us within this realm. Today's guest on the show is someone who is dedicated to exploring the many mysteries in life, and in doing so, has dedicated himself to the ancient practice of Akhanda yoga, not only in his own life, but also in how he serves others, and has also used his life experiences to create his podcast, the Yoga Connection Podcast, and also write his book, The Future Life Progression Book. In today's episode, we will be diving into the idea of time travel through psilocybin, his thoughts on complementary practices to assist in experiencing deeper levels of transcendentalism within the psychedelic space, and much, much more. So please help me in welcoming my brother, Yogi Zorananda, to the show. Yogi Zorananda, my man, I am so excited to be here with you today, my brother. You know, we've been chatting for a while through Instagram. I had to reschedule once. It's divine timing right now. Great to have you here with me, man.
Man, it feels good. Thank you so much for having me on. Yeah. And very much looking forward to our conversation because psychedelics has been a central point in my life. So having the opportunity to talk about my stories and what I've gone through, it means a lot to me. And I'm stoked to have your listeners experience and be a part of this conversation for sure.
Yeah, man, 100%. You know, when we were chatting, I knew immediately I had to get you on the show. And I'm so excited to have you on. You know, where I really like to start these, my man, is, you know, how you first got introduced to psychedelics. You know, for someone like you, it's into yoga and so many different self-development practices, and you have a book and you got all these things going on. You know, it's like, how did someone like you find their way to psychedelics?
So initially, I first did mushrooms when I was 16 years old. And it was through the vein of, being a part of friend groups who parties and smokes weed. And it was introduced to me in that vein of having a good friend of mine that we smoked a lot of weed together. We skateboard together, played guitar together. And so essentially he introduced it to me. So one night he was just like, "Hey man, I've got a bunch of mushrooms. You want to try mushrooms with me?" And we both did 4 grams. And so like the first time doing mushrooms, doing 4 grams. And and so we just like chilled in his basement and watched the Pink Floyd, The Wall movie, and just had a crazy time tripping out. And it's interesting looking back at that and thinking about the trajectory of my life from that point on and seeing how the initial experience was pretty innocent and it was not so heavily spiritual, but it laid a groundwork, right? And it got me into starting to think about how malleable our reality is. And though, you know, in our waking day-to-day life, we have our routines and our regiments and everything can be so mundane, but then we try psychedelic and it just opens us up to all this new spectrum of colors and movement and psychedelia. And so being a 16-year-old and trying this for the first time and seeing just what is available to experience was pretty groundbreaking for me.
Wow. And especially like diving directly into the deep end, man, like 4 grams your first time, that must have been an interesting experience for sure. You know, I'm curious for you, like, did at any point, had your friend tried them before? Like, at what point did you realize like, oh, this is a lot? Like, or was it a lot? You know, was it manageable? Like, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So because this was nearly 20 years ago, I'm just trying to get a good sense. Yeah, I think I think viscerally it was a lot, like the gut rot feeling and just like the turbulence of the waves, right? So how the waves come in. And from what I can remember, it wasn't so strikingly visual, where of course you close your eyes and you see all of the movement, right? And all of the just like psychedelia that's taking place. But I think for me at the time, because I was so naive and so young, my understanding of how to go into it wasn't there yet. And so my overall influence was just my world around me, of seeing the walls melt and watching Pink Floyd The Wall. And then the come down, where suddenly there's this openness that takes place, and the level of conversation that my friend and I were having about life in the world, that's where I think it was more impactful than those first few hours of coming up and riding the wave, where being the first time and being a large dose, I'm just trying to survive all the feelings, right? And, trying not to throw up and all these things, where I would say, from what I remember, the most impactful was right at the come down part, where suddenly I just feel this huge burst of serotonin, and I'm having the experience with my friend, and we're connecting on a whole new level, where, we were friends for maybe 3 years at that point. And suddenly it just created this new bond that we can share together. And I would say, coming out of that, it allowed me to view creativity in my life in a new way, right? Because I grew up kind of musical, more so in the arts, and being a painter and into drawing, and getting into playing guitar and getting into playing music with my friend. That's where it just really cracked me open and wanting to really dive into the musical world. So that's where I think at that point, how something like mushrooms can really reshape the brain into adopting a arduous task like guitar and music is, right? So unless you're younger, like 8 or 9 or something, and you have kind of a musical family, the influence of becoming a musician is much more easier than just taking it on yourself. No one in your family is musical, and then having something like mushrooms and psilocybin to really show you that path. And I think that's what it really helped me do.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And, it's funny because I remember the first time I did mushrooms, I was 23, right? So a little bit older, and only did a gram to tiptoe my way in. But, I think that depending on where you're at in your evolution, right? Like, there could have been a whole lot going on, but unless you actually are aware of what to process, it can just seem like a bunch of stuff happening. And it took me years of connecting with specifically psilocybin to be able to evolve physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually to the level where I can actually understand, or at least start to understand, what I'm being shown, right? Oh, that's my heart chakra opening up. Oh, that's a limiting belief coming forth. Oh, that's a story. Oh, that's a sensation that feels uncomfortable. It's related to this story, right? Like those kind of through lines. But before I had that, it just felt like every time I would go in, it was like a werewolf experience, right? Where, okay, I'm a human. Now I eat mushrooms. Now I'm going through this really uncomfortable kind of in between type purgatory experience, like the werewolf stage, I call it. And then all of a sudden, just like you said, there's that point of peak. And then the second you start to come down, typically it's very similar for me. I get that huge serotonin boost. Then my words come back to me, and I end up being able to have really powerful conversations with the people I'm with. But before that, it can be like that werewolf stage where you're like, I don't even know what's happening. This is just happening to me right now. I know it's happening for me at the same time, right? But it's also happening to me. And I think that's one of the funniest things in psychedelic experiences, depending on how deep you go, is, being able to really be aware throughout it, right? Certain medicines like 5-MeO DMT, good luck being aware through that, right? I think part of that process is to forget during it. But with psilocybin, cannabis, even LSD, and some other medicines too, that's been one of my favorite parts, is starting to notice how the inner work that I'm doing and the self-development work directly pertains to how well I'm able to navigate that experience, and I'm really interested, for you being such a, a yoga fanatic, having someone, or being someone that has gone through so much training like that, did you notice a similar correlation, in your later psychedelic experiences where you were like, oh, I can understand what these things are more because of maybe the context I've had throughout my life with regards to certain training systems, certain education, things like that? Did you notice a trend with that as well? Hey, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. I wanted to take a quick moment to let you all know that the doors are officially open for the Conscious Cannabis Collective. And as such, this is the last week you can sign up and receive all of the bonuses we're currently including. This is the last time I will be personally onboarding those of you who sign up with a complimentary one-on-one session, and you'll have the ability to get the Grow with Cannabis course for free during this limited time. For more info on how you can take advantage of this offer, head down to the show notes for this episode and secure your spot today, as we only have so many spots left and they are filling up quickly. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I did definitely notice that there was a level of preparation leading into the psychedelic experience that I didn't really necessarily have to intend for. It's not like I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to do this psychedelic regardless of what it is. I'm going to do all this yoga. I found that there was a relationship that was symbiotic, that was more synchronistic in nature. So I just have to focus on my yoga practice and my spiritual practice, and then the calling for psychedelic experience comes in. So then I'll just feel it in my body. The idea will pop up into my mind and I'll be like, oh, okay, I'm going to go on this journey. And there's a level of communication that's intuitive that's coming through, that's guiding me to that point. So as long as I just stick with my yoga practice, doing my breath work, doing my meditation, that the desire to do this psychedelic will be then met with all the work that I've done, right? So it's like every single day you are adding to this potency that I, at least in my experience, I didn't have to really focus on it too deeply. And I just found once I was in the midst of the psychedelic experience, I call it yoga mode. So I would be in the psychedelic experience and all of a sudden you would just click in, and it's the consciousness of yoga that would all of a sudden kick in, and that's all that my brain is operating on. And almost if you were an outsider and you were around, you would almost get a sense like I'm suddenly obsessive, because that's just what my conversation is. That's what I'm doing. I'm off in the corner. I'm doing asana. I'm doing breath work. I'm meditating. Even if it's in large gatherings, I'm just like, I'm in yoga mode. I'm just going to go do my thing for a little bit. I'm going to tap in. And then suddenly people just start to come into my world and want to experience what's happening. They just see me and they're like, what is with this guy? And then all of a sudden, all this outpouring of wisdom comes through. And there's really no sense of control of it. There's really nothing about it in my mind that's like, oh, I need to make this happen. It's just a tap is flowing. And I would say when that really kicked in was when I was 19 years old. There was a really particular mushroom experience that I had that showed me that when I was first getting into meditation around 17, 18 years old, that there was this bridge that was being made. And so the way that I approach psychedelic experiences is that I like to have large period of times between them. So a year or more. And that allows me to really dive into my practice so that there's no real dependence on the psychedelic experience. So I don't think to myself, well, I don't have to do my spiritual practice. I can just go do DMT. I can just go do LSD. And so that really came through within a couple of experiences. And even before coming onto this podcast, I've been thinking about that particular experience was when I was 19. I would love to tell the story. It's a little bit lengthy, but I think, just given the podcast name and everything, right? So the nature of this is really along the lines of innocence and curiosity and not having any expectation. And what I experienced, I had no idea this was going to happen. Right. And it really set the ground or the framework for what my work is in yoga, and a particular theory that I have about time travel that I really thought about when I was around 14. So, before getting into the story, I was watching this program with my dad when I was like 13 or 14. And I think it was with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And he had this whole thing about this new machine that was made that whips these particles around in a spiral. And they were able to kind of blip a particle in and out. And he was explaining how this could be the first instance of time travel. And after I watched this program, it didn't really make sense to me, because I was thinking, well, why do we need this huge machine? Why do we need machines at all? And I started to contemplate, well, aren't we the time traveling machine? Like, we are the ones that are actually experiencing time. We're the one that are calculating time and measuring it. And we even view ourselves as moving through space and also moving through time. So technically, wouldn't that mean we're the time traveler? At least in a linear forward way. And so my thought then was, well, I'm going to do it. I'm 14 years old. I have no idea how this is going to come about, but I had this tantalizing thought of, well, I think it's possible for us to do it. So 5 years later, I'm working at a restaurant with a few of my friends, and it was in the middle of the summer on a Tuesday afternoon. My friend and I were opening the line in the restaurant because we were line cooks. And just randomly, I look at him. It's like 3 p.m. in the afternoon. I'm like, hey, man, do you want to do some mushrooms? And he just looked back at me and he was like, yeah, when do you want to do it? I was like, well, when is your next day off? And he's like, Thursday. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. We got to work. The next day he comes up to me. He's like, hey, you really want to do mushrooms? I just said, yeah, I think it would be fun. He's like, okay, there's a few of us that all have that day off. Either two people opened and they have the afternoon off. And it was this strange alignment that we just all, and we were the like all-star crew of the night of the restaurant. Right. And we're like, sweet. Okay. So Thursday comes, we get an ounce and split it between 5 of us. So that turns out to be like 5.5 grams each. And so we get the mushrooms. We went to Wendy's. I just like packed all the mushrooms in a couple burgers. We smoked a fat joint and ate the burgers. And I totally forgot, even mid eating the burgers, because I hid it under the cheese. I totally forgot. So about an hour or like half an hour, it starts to kick in, right? And it's that moment, like, especially when you smoke weed and do mushrooms, because then you have that short-term memory loss, and then you start feeling it in your cheeks, you start feeling it in your body. And I just remember having it kick in and be like, oh yeah, oh my God, I ate 5 grams of fucking mushrooms and just took off. There were really particular things that started to happen that never happened to me before doing mushrooms, because by that time I've already done it a few times. And one thing I started to notice is that my hands were communicating to me, and I would look at them and I would hear and feel my left hand say to me, I'm your left hand. And my right hand would be like, I'm your right hand. And I would look at them and they're like, don't touch us together. And I was like, that's interesting. And they're like, and don't put us in your pockets. We don't want to be in your pockets. And don't make fists. Just keep your hands open. And it was starting to trip me out, because I'm like, well, why? It doesn't matter, right? And then so I tried to experiment with it. I brought my hands together, and then my hands started shaking, convulsing, and like gripping so tight, and my hands yelled at me, and I had to ungrip them. And I'm like, okay, there's something happening where my hands are just now sentient and conscious and communicating to me. And so I just let them be. And we just went on with our day. And the first, it was around 5 in the afternoon, or maybe like 6 in the evening when it started. You know, it's still hot and sunny, and we're walking around downtown, just kind of normal trip. Where things really took a turn was when it started to get to the nighttime. So Edmonton has a large river that goes through the middle of it. And my friend James, he lived downtown. And so we would go from his place, we'd walk across the high level bridge, we'd go to the White Ave area, the south side of the river, and we'd walk back. And we did this 4 or 5 times, just super high, right? We don't even know what to do, just walking back and forth. And we finally decided, okay, we're going to go to James' house and just chill. So we go to his place, and we're in the front entrance, but we're locked out. And he looks at us and he's like, guys, I forgot my keys. And we're sitting there starting to panic, right? We're like, well, like shit, his girlfriend was working and she doesn't get off work until like 1 o'clock in the morning, right? And it's like 10 by this time. And suddenly I get this immediate sense that I'm going to die. And I could not explain it. I'm looking around and I have this feeling of like flashing, and I'm just receiving this communication. You're about to die. And I just breathe, and I become super calm. And I just say to myself, okay, I accept it. If this is the time that I'm going to die, I think I'm ready. I'm feeling really good. I don't know why I'm going to, but I think I just have to accept it. Right then and there, we see the elevator open, and a guy walks out of the elevator and stops and sees us. And he just stops and starts to panic a little bit because we're all staring at him. And he slowly comes to the door and opens the door, and James grabs the door. He's like, I'm so sorry. I just forgot my keys. I live here. I live in this apartment. Like, don't worry. We're not weird or anything, but really weird because we're all rolling on 5 grams of mushrooms each. Go up to his apartment. As I'm walking into the lobby, I look back and I'm like, okay, what was that? Right. And then, so something is starting to shift in me. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I had this very visceral feeling that I was going to die, but you know, here I am. So we go up to his room, to his apartment. We sit down in his living room, and we sit in this arrangement that forms a triangle. So James is on my left, my other friends are on my right, and I'm sitting on a stool at this kind of apex of this triangle. And we decided to watch the movie The Departed. And that movie absolutely blew my mind. It like we started to watch, and I remember this line. I'll remember this line forever. It's the opening line from Jack Nicholson, and he says, I don't want to be the product of my environment. I want the environment to be a product of me. And that just blew my mind. And as the movie went on, I'm like, oh my God, the acting is incredible. Like the scenes, like everything, what is going on? I'm just so grasped by this. And we're in the dark. So prior to this, we smoked a bunch of weed. And what I was noticing is that it had no effect on me. No matter how much I smoked, I just couldn't feel it. And I even tested it out. We just sparked a joint, and it got to me. And I'm like, okay, how much of this joint can I smoke before I even feel it? Because normally when you smoke good weed, you know, it hits you, you cough and whatever, right? You feel it kind of burn in your lungs. I smoke half this joint in one pull. I just like completely filled my lungs. And I'm like, okay, this is really intense, but lights are out. We're watching. And this next moment is what completely changed how I viewed psychedelics and how I started to develop this theory about time travel. Because I've told this story to many people, and when I get to a particular point, I don't know how to really explain it to get people to grasp what happens. But what I know for myself is that certain people are going to have a capability of traversing these outer realms beyond where we are. And for whatever reason, naturally, I have this ability, and it's not something that I really use to gloat about or really even try to like advertise. But the older and older I get, the more I start to see that there's something about mushrooms that is not yet discovered. And I feel like there's going to be a time where it would be useful for me to kind of step into the science around this, because it was absolutely fantastic. So we're watching this movie and everything goes black. I'm no longer in the room. I'm no longer high on mushrooms. So that's the first thing I notice. I'm back to being sober. And I'm trying to look around. Everything's black. Everything's gone. And the first question that pops up is, okay, who am I right now? And I feel myself take a step back and to the left and up. And then I see me in white robes, illuminating white light. And at the time, I did have long hair, but I couldn't grow facial hair for the life of me at the age of 19. And so I see myself with this big, long beard, long flowing hair. And I'm looking at myself, and the first thing that I say out loud in that space that I am, Jesus Christ. I'm like, what the hell is that? But it felt so good. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going back in there. And I went back into that body. And then right then and there, as soon as I went back into that, everything about my perception changed. There was zero thought. Everything was awareness. Everything was focus. And as soon as I went back into my body and into that form, there was a spotlight just ahead of me, maybe like 10, 15 feet. This yellow light, like a cone, shone down on the floor. And there was a little boy in the light. And this little boy, blonde hair, blue eyes, with a piece of chalk, doodling on the ground. But he wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. And he was kind of looking around, aimlessly drawing with his chalk. So I walked up to the boy. I looked at him and I said, what are you doing? And the boy looked at me, didn't say anything, just shrugged, and then went back aimlessly drawing. And I just thought, and I said to him, what do you mean you don't know? You have infinite possibility to do whatever you want with that piece of chalk right now. And the boy just ignored me. So I went up to him, grabbed the piece of chalk, and looked at him and said, watch this. I turned to my right and I started to draw a full circle on what would be a wall. It was just all black. And I started going faster and faster and faster and faster. The lines of the chalk of the circle started getting thicker and thicker and thicker. Then it opened up into a portal. I looked at him, gave him the piece of chalk, went into the portal. And the next stage of everything again disappearing, but this time I'm in this whole realm of energy. And I have this S-like shape in front of me, like this little wave, and it's flipping and turning everywhere. And I knew with my awareness, I had to stay focused on that shape. If I were to look away, I'd be pulled somewhere and I would never come back. I just like knew it. And so I'm following the shape. The shape is flipping, going everywhere, all over the place. It's almost testing me. Like this shape is like, oh yeah, like how much longer are you going to focus? But in my mind, I'm so 100% focused. There's nothing that can take my mind off of this. So then it suddenly flips and turns horizontal and just goes off into the left and right. Then from the middle of that line, this little green square starts to form and starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger, coming closer and closer and closer to me. And then it opens up to this rectangular screen. That's like emerald green rectangular screen. And then suddenly, boom, it just opens up to a scene of me in my apartment with my friend, and we're playing guitar together. And this is the friend that I first did mushrooms with. Mm. And we're playing guitar, and I'm looking at the screen, and I reach in and I go into it. And this is the trippy part. Okay. This is where I tried to explain to people the significance of this. I became physical again. I don't really know how, at least at that point, but I became fully 100% physical again. I went into that, became physical. I could feel my guitar. I was looking at my friend, and I stopped playing, and I just went silent for a second. And I'm feeling the guitar frets, and I'm like, what the fuck is happening right now? And I'm looking around, I'm looking at my friend, and he says, well, hey, what are you doing? We were just in the middle of playing a song. What's happening? And then it just all dawns on me, and I'm like, holy shit, I'm not here right now. I'm sitting on a stool in the dark at James's house, high on fucking mushrooms. How is this possible? And then it just like, I start just to get excited. I'm like, oh my God, I've got to tell my friend, I've got to tell him this. Right. And I'm like, dude, I'm not here right now. And he's like, what do you mean you're not here right now? I'm like, I don't know, man. And then as I tried to explain it, there's this block. It's like wherever I am in that realm's like, nuh-uh, no, you're not allowed. And so I'm trying to tell him, I'm like, I'm in the past. I'm not here. I don't, and it just starts to mumble, and he starts laughing at me, and I start laughing again. I start laughing as well. And then I'm pulled out of it, and I'm back into that like energetic realm. And the screen turns emerald green. It collapses. It disappears into the horizon. That S shape comes back. I travel again with it. And then this time it flips again, but this time it just opens up into these rolling hills of energy. And I'm just in it, and there's no thoughts. I'm just being in this space. Then I'm pulled out of it. James's girlfriend is sitting on a stool next to me. She stands on the stool and touches the ceiling. And that brings me back, because I see it and I look, and I'm like, whoa, what are you doing? And she looks at me and she's like, I don't know. And gets down off the stool and goes into the kitchen and like forgets. And I'm just looking around, and I'm like, holy shit, I'm back. And I'm back on mushrooms, and I can feel it. And I'm like, okay, so I sit there for a second. I'm like, okay, all of that just happened. I need to like recount all of that, because like, and the thing that I led to, I was like, okay, I was the being of light or whatever, Jesus and boy and the portal, but then I became physical again. And I'm like, okay, so I tell his girlfriend, I'm like, I think it's time for us to go home. Can you drive us home? Right? Drives us home. The next day, my friend calls me, and he's like, hey man, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm just at home chilling, man. You won't believe the night that I had last night. And he's like, well, I'm just 5 minutes from your house, man. I'll come over. We'll play guitar and we'll chill. So he comes over. I buzz him up to my apartment. He comes in. He goes, gets his guitar. I grab my guitar. I sit down exactly where I was sitting. And he's sitting across from me, and we start playing, and it just hits. The moment's happening. And I'm like, holy fuck. and I'm like I'm doing everything that happened. I'm doing everything, and I'm looking at him, and he's like, yo, why'd you stop? And I'm like, oh my God, this is blowing my mind. And I'm like, dude, oh my God, I'm not here right now. And then we just start laughing. And I'm waiting for the moment that I go back, but it doesn't happen, right? And we're just like, we just start laughing. We're like, oh my God, this is just too fucking wild. So somehow in my mushroom trip, I went a day into the future. And at that point, I'm thinking, this is one-off, right? Somehow this thing happened. And at that time, the social media was in its infancy. Looking this stuff up was kind of hard on the internet. But fast forward, I think by this time, 8 years later, I'm at a local festival here in Alberta called Freezer Burn. So it's like a Burning Man festival that, they have pop-up festivals, everywhere. And I do some mushrooms, but this time it's only like 2 grams. Because at this point, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do a hero dose like that. I haven't done one like that since then. And so I just do a couple of grams and, have a great time at this festival. And by the end of the night, I'm in my girlfriend at the time's van, and because they were all still partying, and I'm like, I'm going to, I want to just go lay down. Watching the sunrise, just seeing the sunrise come through the window and see how the light refracts through the glass. And it was just so beautiful. And I'm seeing all these codes of light and I'm seeing all these geometries, and I close my eyes and I see that same kind of rolling hill of energy, but it's the crown chakra, like all the different petals of the crown chakra. And I'm looking at it in my mind and I'm just seeing it undulate and move. And I think to myself, could I stop it and take it and flip it in front of me and see the center of it? And without even really any other delay, I just do it. I stop it, I flip it in front of me, and I see the circle of light, the dot in the middle of the like crown chakra mandala. And I just go into it, and I'm back into that energetic portal. And this time there's no S shape. Everything's so rapid. All of a sudden the screen pops up again. And this time I'm seeing the ocean, and I'm seeing cliffs like in England or in Scotland or something. And I'm seeing the same kind of situation, sun rising. And I'm like, holy fuck, it's happening again. And I'm like, okay, there's something to this now. I'm taking a moment to pause and I'm seeing this and I'm like, okay, I really need to observe what happens when I go through this now, right? Not really paying attention where that is, right? Because I'm like overlooking the ocean and these cliffs. And so I test my hand out. So I bring my hand to the screen. And as I'm putting it through, my fingers start to pixelate. I'm seeing them pixelate into all these millions of pixels, and then become physical again. And I'm feeling it become physical, but there's no pain or anything. It's just, and I'm putting my hand in slowly and I'm watching this process. And then I put my head through, I put my other arm through, and I'm putting my other leg through, just about to fully go through. I look down and I'm like 200 feet in the air, and it freaks me out. And I'm like, pull myself back. I'm like, no way am I going to try to do that, because I'm becoming physical again. And I'm like, no way. If I fall and die, they're just going to find a dead body somewhere randomly. And like, no. So I pull myself back and I'm like, this is real. I'm like, what I experienced when I was 19, this is real. There's something about mushrooms that's so much more complex than just, emotional healing and, the psychedelic, there's really a portal opening up that I can go through and legitimately become physical again. So this was at a point where I was right in the middle of all my yoga, right? Where I was like deep, doing 2 hours a day, doing like hour and a half meditations, and really learning about what it means to connect to your chakras. And so by this time I'm thinking, okay, there's something about the congruency between the DMT that we have in our body and the tryptamines that are in the mushrooms, where we're able to interface and we're actually able to portalize the substance, and that we can then use that as a way to travel between places. And so what my theory is that what mushrooms are doing is that it is activating the endogenous DMT in us, and that the DMT within our pineal gland allows us to flip from particle to wave. And so that feeling of me where I'm going to that black space, and then I open up the portal, and then I go into that energetic realm was me becoming a wave. And that when you're in that time space realm, those petals or those screens are moments in time, and that you can bring up those moments of time, and it allows you to then reemerge back physically, and that there's already a mechanism in place. It's not something that I have to like develop or make. It's just that that's a part of the construct of how reality works. But it's something that is seemingly, at least now, not so explored. And I just so happen to be someone who's been able to explore this. And since then, I haven't replicated it, because I'm like, well, there's a time and a place, right? Happened when I was 19, happened when I was around 26, 27. And so now I'm thinking, okay, well, if I really want to explore this, and I really want to have a tactile way of studying this, it's got to be done in a safer setting, and it's got to be done in a way where, what if I can control where I go? So the next time, and it's typically, even when I was 19, it came at around the come down mark, right? So it's right at that precipice of right when you're at the peak and you're about to come down, that there's this openness that happens where then you can transmit yourself out of your body or that it's not even outer body. It's just right in that moment, you're having a totally visceral experience. And so my theory is that when you go into that space, that you can then interface with that screen, and you can go Manhattan, 12 p.m. on the street, on the sidewalk. And I don't know if there's that much control, because in my last two experiences, it was pretty uncontrollable. The first time was like, I feel like maybe I was pretty lucky that I went into my apartment. And the second time was like, like, don't press your luck.
Dude, that is unbelievable, man. I mean, it's believable, right? But I'll say unbelievable for sake of conversation. Like, it makes a lot of sense too. I wouldn't say I've had that experience, but I've had definitely similar ones that speak to a similar theory around time travel. One thing I discovered with a group of people on LSD one time, a few years back, was we had all connected with LSD. And like every LSD story starts, it was more than I thought it was going to be, right? I don't think anyone takes acid and was like, oh, that was exactly what I thought it would be. Like mushrooms, yeah, you get more, but at least you ate a lot, right? LSD is just a little piece of paper and you never really know, right? So one of those experiences where we probably took like a 300 mic tab. So it was definitely more than I had thought, right? So I think we took a tab and a half, so maybe it was like 150, something like that. But basically, what happened was we had all been connecting. It was at a men's retreat, right? So me and the men there, we had connected really heavily. And then when the retreat ended, we had like a get together, right? So my partner came, a bunch of people's partners came, other men, other women, etc. So now it was like kind of like an accentuated party, right? So that night, the guy who was hosting the retreat was telling me, hey, we're getting a yoga instructor to come tomorrow. I'm like, oh, cool. So, I went around and I was like, oh, does anyone want to do LSD tomorrow? Did anyone bring any, right? So I find a group and we do it. And the next day, while we're all on it, we had done yoga. It was beautiful, just a great day. Beautiful, like 55, sunny, awesome. It was in December in Austin. And so what happened was we all decided to do a cannabis ceremony during it, right? A couple of people would ask me, hey, can you host a cannabis ceremony? I'm like, sure, that sounds great. So we do this cannabis ceremony. It was like 25 of us that went in on this ceremony. And at the end, everyone's hugging, crying, laughing. It was just one of those beautiful like moments. And I had been doing this new style of breath work that, I had been used to doing Wim Hof and longer holotropic sessions. And this was kind of like a quick ROI, right? 10 breaths into the nose, out through the mouth, super quick. Hold, pop, lock it, and just get a boost, right? A little lift off. Now, I had been doing this all week with a buddy of mine there, and it was very normal, right? We were completely sober the entire week. So it was nice, right? So at the end, I decided, guys, let's do a round of breath work. Like everyone's so connected. We'll close out the circle with this. It'll be great. Paul Chek had just taught me his Om technique, where you breathe in all together and you raise your arms up, and then you Om on the way down, right? And so I was like, guys, let's rock a couple of these Oms. Let's all harmonize to each other's energy. So we do a couple of those, 3 to be exact. And then we rip around a breath work. And I had no idea what was going to happen next, because what happened was all 25 of us left our bodies. Like it literally felt like when we and then let go, it shot me so fucking far out into the nebula galaxy. And I didn't know what the hell happened. And then everyone else came back and everyone had the same face on. Like, what was that? And my buddy Danny was like, let's go again. So then we proceeded to do like 20 rounds of this breathing. And every round it would get deeper and deeper and deeper. People were dropping off every single round. Like people were like shaking their head and just leaving. Like, and I wasn't really checking in like to see like what had been happening as I was leading the breath work. So my buddy Matt, who is a sendero, right? He was like, dude, I love this. Let's go for it. I was like, okay. So there was one particular round where we stopped doing 10 breaths and we started doing 15. And then another round we did 20. And when we got to 20, there was a specific round where he tapped out. He was like, I'm done, and just walked away. And so we take a break, and I start talking to people about what this experience just was. And I asked Matt, I'm like, hey, what happened? Why'd you tap out? I'm like, was it how far out you went? He's like, no, it was how hard it was to get back in. And so I had a couple experiences that shook me during this 20 something rounds of breath work. One of them specifically, when I came back, I felt like I landed like over here, right? And for everyone listening, I'm picturing like a foot to my left. I felt like I landed over there and everything was like upside down, not literally, but like everything I knew about life was different. Like the way I thought, the way I felt, I was out of my body. My body was over here. Like there were it just felt wrong. Like it just felt like no. And then all of a sudden, boom, I'm snapped back into my body. And I'm like, what was that? Like, where was that? What was that phenomenon? So then we did a couple more rounds later on. And one of my buddies, Danny, one round we put on some pretty intense music. We were like, let's just see what happens, right? We were in our curiosity phase. And he came back crying that time. And he was like, dude, I just went somewhere really dark. So we started mapping out this area and we started realizing like, okay, like on a scientific level, yes, we're connecting with a psychedelic. It's probably somehow accentuating our endogenous DMT. It made like enough logical sense where I'm like, okay, this does make sense. But it's interesting because now, 3 years later, I've done this many times for many people in many different states of mind. And what I found is that cannabis definitely works, right? Cannabis is more of like it will really allow you to release trauma doing this. Like you'll just come back tremoring like crazy. You can definitely go pretty far out, but it's more of like a somatic experience, if you will. Mushrooms, on the other hand, will straight wipe you out. Just like 5-MeO DMT. Like it is legitimately just like a 5 experience, but it only lasts for about 5 to 6 seconds. But during that time, you escape the parallels of time. So it can feel like years. And that's what's happened to me before. I've come back having lived entire lifetimes. And like as soon as I start to try to talk about it, it all just leaves like a dream. And what was so real a minute second before is now like fantasy. And I've had many of those experiences. And so then with LSD, it sends you so far out that it can be borderline scary, right? MDMA, full body orgasm, right? We probably expected that. MDMA is one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had doing this type of breath work. And for everyone listening, like, be careful. Like, I'm not saying go out and do this. Like, I'm saying definitely be careful if you try to do this, just like with everything I ever talk about on these shows. But, what I found was that during these experiences, like, once I was able to get there with psychedelics, I've always been able to get there ever since, right? So now when I do breath work, sometimes, especially if I wake right up and I go do breath work, and my theory here is that I have more melatonin, which acts as a precursor for endogenous DMT. But if I wake up, I would go out on my deck and I would do it during the summer. This was like last year, I think. And I've had many of these experiences now, but they're so common that like this was like the first one that was really interesting. So at the house I was at this point, there was a school behind me, right? So I'm in a completely sober state of mind. I just woke up. I go outside, set up my meditation pillow, and I would do breath work before I meditated. So I was just typical day in the office, right, so to speak. And I blast off on this breath work, first round too. So like typically the rounds get stronger as you go, but this was the first round. And what happened was as I go out, I like kind of like slump backwards. And at that point, I saw hundreds of children around me, right? Hundreds, right? I could see their shirts and everything. The overwhelming feeling that came over me was like, oh my God, I look so stupid. I have no idea why, but that was the thought I had, like, oh my God, this is so stupid. And then literally I come back and obviously no one's there. And like, it started fading slowly but surely. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, what the fuck was that? And so I've had like hundreds of these types of just interesting experiences where I enter different realms. I've never seen specifically a screen or anything like that. Like that is absolutely amazing, but it also makes perfect sense, right? Like you said, turning particle into wave, right? And when you talk to people like Hamilton Souther, people like this, like they always talk about this. One of the first stories I heard from Hamilton was when he first went down to the Amazon, he met this guy who just nonchalantly was like, hey man, go stand on that rock over there. And he was like, okay. And he goes and stands on the rock. And the second he stands on it with both feet, he's in Africa, right? And he's like looking around and he's like seeing zebras and giraffes and like all this crazy shit. He's still on the rock, right? In this like vision he's having. And he steps off and he's like, what the hell was that? And the guy just nonchalantly is like, oh, that's Africa. Like that brings you to Africa. And it was like this thing where it's like, why is that surprising? Like, yeah, the rock brings you to Africa. So I think there's a lot that we don't understand yet. I mean, obviously, right? Like, I think we're still in our infantile stages. And, it would make so much sense. Like, why would we ever need, like, if we are God living a human experience, if everything is God, just like the animists view it, then at the end of the day, why would we ever need anything external to us to be able to access these things, right? That's why I personally think that psychedelics
Yeah.
are reminders, right? Because I think that the creator, God, whatever you want to call it, I think he, she, it, whatever you want to call it, I think they knew at a certain point that we would go through this stage where we forgot and we became very left brain, very linear, very logical. I only believe in what I can see and measure. And there would be a certain point where we would remember how important the other realm was. And if you think about psychedelics, mushrooms grow out of poop. Cannabis will grow through cement. Ayahuasca vine will grow through cement. Wachuma is a cactus, right? So peyote, all these different things. So like, I heard someone state at one time, like, if God was, seeing all this, what he would say is, well, by the time that they've realized they really need these, hopefully they won't have eradicated them. So we have to make them very hardy. And so I think that's really what's happening right now in like a slowed down fashion, of course, right? Like, we're starting to see this fourth density consciousness come into the reality. We're starting to see people start to talk more about shadow work and all of these things right in the mainstream. They're not even being hidden anymore. Psychedelics are being researched by Johns Hopkins and Harvard and these very prestigious schools. And so a lot of like even 5 years ago, what was on the fringe is now like mainstream. So it's happening at a very accelerated rate. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, man. It's amazing hearing that story. I'm just like so grateful that you shared that, man, because now I know what I'm going to do the next time I sit with mushrooms. I'm going to be like, okay, let me just play with this very carefully, right? Let me just see if I can see a screen anyway. Start there,
Yeah. And I think the important like precursor is the geometry. At least in my mind, I'm just naturally a more visual person, even in my mind. And what I notice is that when I close my eyes, there's this network of geometry that's playing out. And what I've noticed over, I would say, the last like 20 years of doing psychedelic experiences is there's a way to develop a keen skill in navigating the geometry. And what it seems like is that it's not so much about getting caught up in the beautifying aspect of it. It's how you then focus into the center of it, and that there's this channeling into the portal within it. And so I think the geometry is a represented network of how the pineal gland is activated and what the endogenous DMT within that center is doing to then create the nodes so that you can then enter into it and safely navigate it. And it seems like the geometry is intelligent in and of itself, and like how it's coalescing, how it's coming together isn't something really that I'm having to focus and control and contort in order to make it happen, with that one exception of like, okay, well, it's kind of in this state of being this, like undulating wave. What if I do this, right? Where even in our fiction, right, of magicians or wizards and the arduous task that they have in conjuring things, right? Where with the power of our brain and the power of our being itself is that there's this innate organization that's taking place. And I think at least what I've discovered with the yoga practice and, the mystical schools around the earth is that there's a development of spiritual capabilities that's taking place that is turning from autonomic to very clear, perceptive, very conscious way of utilizing the body. And so I've started to see the human body as a biological mechanism. And so rather than having the attachments to it that we would normally have of like, well, I'm going to do this and I want to have this job and I want to eat this food and I want to do I, that you retract that and you start to observe and look at your body as a form of technology, and that it's a biological technology that is created through the earth. And so there are gatekeepers to the levels of how you're going to explore expanding through a spiritualized sense of yourself. And that's where I think there's these natural initiations, right? And so that's why there's a whole set of people who will never have this conversation, right? They will never hear this podcast. They will never in their life ever contemplate what it means to be like this. And so there's this necessity of having a large majority of people that are just earthly humans. Mm-hmm. And their goal or their task is just to be the most basic human, and that's totally fine. And then as it scales to more and more spirituality, the percentage of people who are going to grasp these things goes lower and lower and lower and lower. And then there's a kind of karma in place, or a kind of dharma, where there's people like you and and it's still, I think, still within the millions, but in the grand scheme of like billions of people, right? If you have just like a few million people who are into this stuff, that's still a small percentage. And so there are people who just come to this planet equipped with the mechanisms in their body to actually be able to crystallize how to experience a greater spiritual existence. And on my podcast, I interviewed my yoga teacher. His name's Yogi Vishvaketu. And I asked him the question, how did you get into yoga? And he looked at me and he's like, I didn't get into yoga. This body came with yoga. And that was huge. That blew my mind. And I was like, you know what? That really makes sense. And it got me to think about my own life of being a kid and doing like headstand and shoulder stand and full wheel and like doing all these yoga poses when I was 8 or 9 years old and not even knowing it. And even looking back, when I was a kid, I used to do this thing where I'd lay on my stomach and I would just take deep breaths, fill my lungs, and then exhale. And I would feel myself melting into my bed. And it felt so good. And there was one particular time where everything started to feel bigger and bigger and bigger. And the thoughts in my mind, all of a sudden there was this stream of thought that I was just ranting about something. And then I felt like it was just happening. And then I felt myself floating to the ceiling, and then my back hit the ceiling, and it kind of like not scared me, but it just surprised me. And then I felt back to my body and then passed out. And so I think there's just something karmatically and even through the incarnation of our consciousness that we keep things as we incarnate. And so there's this level of spirituality that builds and builds and builds. And so there's just a point where I think as a form of consciousness, as we come in and out of bodies, we're kind of trying to find the body that's going to be the one that can be the greatest tool for our spirituality. So we come into this body, it's in this timeline, it's 1910, and we're going, it's like there's too many shitty lessons. And then you just live your life out and you die and you're like, okay, well, what about this body? And it's 2008 and you're like, holy shit, yeah, but there's all these other weird limitations, So I think what I'm trying to grasp more and more is it possible that what we view as reincarnation isn't actually linear, that we can come out of a body and be like, you know what, I'm going to go into this timeline because I think there's these genetics and there's these parents that are going to actually help me a little bit more in 1766 than it would in, 1987 when I was born. And so a lot of my work has been really navigating that. And right now I'm just kind of bursting out of this incubation period where I've kind of returned back to being a student, and I'm like, okay, I have things that I want to share, but I have a lot of things that I want to work on too. And yeah, my next book, the next project is my overall yoga book kind of encyclopedia. And so, leading up to then, I'm just really having fun being a musician and writing a lot and recording and having conversations like fellows like you, and really wanting to get this theory out there that we're walking around microdosing DMT. Like that blew my mind. When I read Rick Strassman's book, the DMT, the spirit molecule, and he talked about that back in the early 90s. And I'm looking around and I'm like, we're just a fucking psychedelic factory and we don't even know. I'm like, Well, what would happen if majority of the planet, just like we know that we have an endocrine system, just like we know we have blood, just like we know we have a nervous system, what would happen to humanity if we normalize, really scientifically normalize that it's just common knowledge? Oh yeah, I have DMT in me and I'm microdosing DMT. And I started to really look at the fabric of reality, and I'm like, oh, this is a psychedelic experience, and it's so normalized that we call it reality. And it's so normalized that we're just used to it. So it's just like, if you were to take a little bit of mushrooms, so say if you take, like half a gram of mushrooms every day, after a month, you're not gonna even really feel it. It's going to be so normalized in your system, you're not even going to be high anymore. And so I'm like, so what if we don't have memory when we're a child, because it's purposely built in, because we're having a full blown psychedelic experience when we're an infant, because we're so small and all that DMT in us, we're just looking around as an infant, like, we don't even know what to say. We're like, what the fuck? What are you? You're just this weird mass of flesh, And I'm like, and then we grow into this thing that it's like, okay, now we can handle it. We can handle the DMT, and this is reality.
Dude, I love that theory. And it pairs up with a lot of my things, because, one of the things I've seen on Instagram or Facebook that I really liked is what if when you die, you just come back to a group of people and they're all like, did you feel it? Right. And you have a bong in your hand, right? Like that kind of thing. And that dude, that really I know it's supposed to be a joking meme, but that was dude, I really feel like that could be very accurate. Think about it this way, right? My buddy John actually told me a story about how this guy is pretty intense. And for what I'm about to say, everyone listening, do not do this. All right. This is a certain type of human that can handle this. I wouldn't do this. But what he'll do, and I've witnessed this, so I know it's accurate, because it's going to sound completely ridiculous. But what he does is he says, I can't tiptoe with psychedelics, or I have a really bad experience. I have to obliterate my ego. Now, I'm not a big fan of the kill your ego thing. I don't think that's accurate whatsoever. But let's just say, for sake of conversation, getting the ego completely offline is what we're talking about, right? Not that it's bad, just for this experience, it's not going to be handy, right? So what he will do is he'll eat a 10 strip of LSD. Then an hour later, he'll do a 5-gram mushroom tea, right? Lemon tech. Then as he's coming up on that, he'll start hitting DMT over and over out of a Puffco peak, right? And he'll just kind of ride that out until the morning. And then he'll eat peyote buttons in the morning, right? For the sunrise. And so it's one of those things where I'm like, this guy's just built different. One time acid will get me there. I don't need all that, right? But one of the things he said that was very interesting is, I asked him, I said, hey man, have you ever been shook? Cause that's a lot, I was very curious. And what he said was, he goes, no, I've never been really scared. He said, but I did have one really weird experience one time. And I was like, do tell. And he said, well, it was at that stage around 1 to 3 in the morning where I'm just ripping DMT off a Puffco peak every half hour. And I went out one time, right? I took a hit and I went out, and I just saw myself fully embodied in how I would describe it as his God self. The message he got was, dude, you've been doing this for thousands of years. Just one of those things where he's whoa, almost multiverse type stuff, where he was he saw all the different versions of himself in different lifetimes, all ripping, I don't know if it was DMT in every lifetime, but these psychedelic type experiences. And I know for me, one of the things I found is that, just like you said, this reality is a psychedelic. And I think that, right, the clues are everywhere. So in the Bible, right, which I'm not a religious person, but I know a good line when I hear it. And I think that there's a lot of great things in religious texts if you can get past the dogma and whatnot. So it says, if you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you must first enter the mind of a child. So think about what the mind of a child is. It's curiosity, imagination, awe, wonder, and imagination. And so when you really think about that, and you think about how most adults are walking around, right? And I've been there before, I'm sure you've been there, life kind of gets dull. You're like, I've seen trees before. What's different about that one? I've seen cars before. What's different about that one? I take the same way to work every day. I don't even think about it. I'm on autopilot most of the day. And you get home, you do whatever, you throw on Netflix, the typical American life, right? And probably other places too, but typical life, right? And so then you have someone connect with a psychedelic, and all of a sudden they're like, dude, I know I go out this door every day, but I've never looked at it like this before. And everything is brand new again, right? So when you think about your theory around kids being high on DMT, right? Because if you ever watched a kid grow up, it's like watching someone come out of a very slow DMT experience, right? Like, they're literally shitting their pants when they're first born. They don't even have any idea. Then they're painting on walls and shit, and they learn how to walk, right? And then they start to like understand a little bit more, and you can watch them like slowly get acclimated into like what is normal in society, right? So, and then anyone on the outskirts of that is deemed not normal or weird, right? Or psychotic. I have many friends that had been in and out of psych wards their entire life. And now, you know what they do? They draw auras. They read cards, right? Like, and now people pay them a lot of money, right? Because now is the time, right? Like now people are like, no, we've deemed that is now valuable, right? Because we're all having this existential crisis of sorts of like meaning, like, why the hell are we here? Right? At least a lot of us are waking up to that. And so like now I'm starting to see like, oh, that level of consciousness that is still a little bit more in that psychedelic world is now being normalized, right? Or in a way, like maybe not normalized, but not taken for granted anymore, right? People are actually like open to it. And so it's very interesting, man. Like I've dove into this a lot, and I really do think that the best description for life, and the reason I started this podcast, right? It's kind of like a play on words. This one time on psychedelics, well, spoiler alert, you're always on psychedelics. So this podcast can literally talk about anything. Like life is the psychedelic, So I love your frame of thought here, man. I highly agree. Fucking cool.
Yeah. And so fucking cool. And yeah, I think the way that it's helped me is to see just the beauty of every day. Like I live a fairly mundane life as well. I have a 9-to-5 job. I have the similar tasks that I do. And so having that like little bit of realization of that knowledge of like, what if this is just not just a psychedelic trip, but what if I'm having a microdose psychedelic trip every day? So when I look around and I'm looking at myself and I'm looking at just the solidness of everything, and I start to think like, oh, okay, well, it starts to make sense if we're on this low grade or low dose DMT. What if the fabric of everything and the way that we interact with it is really based on that dosage? So what would happen if we increase the dosage? And I really think that's what yoga is. I think they figured it out. That's what Amrita is. Like that's what this spiritual practice is being able to utilize these substances in your body and to amplify it and to put yourself into a state where we switch on and off our nervous system, so that rather than our peripheral nervous system being engaged all the time and, it's going through our limbs, that we do these really specific movements, we do these really specific breath work, we then do this really specific meditation to then draw everything in and bring it up and into the pineal gland. And so that we can then harness a greater capacity of our endogenous DMT and then interface with reality. And then we start to see, okay, things are a little bit more malleable now. Now I can manifest things a little bit more. And I think this goes to such a far degree where you have these stories of yogis who have all these crazy cities where they can just materialize and dematerialize, and they can fly and they can do all these things. And I wonder why it is that some people, say particularly in India, if you've read the autobiography of a yogi, where Paramahansa Yogananda is talking about all these, saints and all these yogis that are doing these crazy things, that when you make your DMT so potent that it comes out of your pores, that it's in your body so much that it's actually coming out and people are breathing it in, people are actually getting high on your DMT. And so when they look at you, boom, you have superpowers, but they're just tripping. And you can be like, boom, I actually have 6 arms. And they're like, holy shit, dude, you have 6 arms. And so I'm starting to think like maybe there's something to this, that like when you do this spiritual work, and that's why there's people like Muji or Sadhguru or these mystics, that people are just gravitated to. It's like magnetic. They just don't even know why. They're like, I just need to be around this person. And it's like, could it be that they have created this concoction in them that is literally coming out of them? And it's like in their electromagnetic field, because when we sweat, not even sweat, but like just our pheromones and just who we are, that comes out, it's in our orbit of our magnetic field, right? And so people come in contact with that and they're like, whoa, this person's different. And then all of a sudden they're having strange dreams, and all of a sudden they're having visions, and they're like, whoa, when I'm around this person, I'm like, something happens, something shifts. And it's like, well, could it be that they're the factory of all this psychedelia inside them, is that they figured it out? They had the key, and they're like, you know what, when I do Sahajang Saradauti, when I do Kapalabhati breath, when I do this sequence of postures, when I do Maha Mudra, when I do Mahabandha, when I do breath of fire, when I put this all together like a chemical equation, right? It's like science. Okay. You have all these variables. When I do this, when I do this, when I do this, when I do this, it's going to equal this. And what that equals is then this potency of energetic exchange. And then you interact with someone, and you just by talking to them, the tone of your voice, everything, it puts them into this altered state, and you're showing them what you're capable of. And so what I've figured out that has like really shifted my yoga practice and really shifted my intention around being a yoga teacher is like, I want to see what my effect and the effect of my presence is going to be, rather than the information that's coming out of my mouth. Where, yeah, I can formulate things in my mind. So I can take all these books that I've read, and I can take all this information, and I can summarize it and put it into this package, and I can tell someone exactly factually this thing. But what if I do this work of all the breath work and all the meditation, and instead of all the information, I just live and I'm a presence? And it's been huge. And so the guidance that came to me, especially after the pandemic of all the lockdowns and all the things, and, you know, losing my yoga classes and all this stuff, this guidance came into me, was like, start with your family, start with your friends, and be a presence of goodness and loving kindness and acceptance. And so it's not about conviction anymore. It's not about, oh, you need to do yoga because of this. You need to just do your work. Know that, because I've been doing this for 15 years now, I've been teaching for 12 years, that there's a wealth of knowledge that I have. And what if the transmittance of yoga is more potent in presence than it is in information? And that's been a huge turning point in my teaching, because then, you know, I'll do private yoga classes here and there. I've kind of stepped away from the studio because I'm like, I don't like the business model. Yeah. And I don't really want to show up and just teach vinyasa. It's like, I have a very, you know, I teach Akhanda yoga. I want to stay true to my teacher's lineage. And so I've been doing privates, and they, after, you know, some time, they come up to me and they're like, man, I have never had a yoga class like that. And I haven't really changed anything. And I'm like, the only thing that I changed is I'm not so information heavy anymore. And I'm just being in the presence that really just feels good, where I connect to my heart, connecting to my breath. And yeah, it's been amazing discovery. And yeah, it's led to this moment here, you know, and doing the podcast with Andre, and then his recommendation and connecting us. I'm like, man, I'm like, just the synchronicities are flowing, and it feels amazing. And I'm just getting networked with just incredible people. It's just amazing. I love it.
Oh, man, that is absolutely incredible. And, you know, I've definitely felt a similar thing with my practices, right? Like, not doing them just to do them as a checklist item, but like doing them as an act of self-love, right? As an act of empowerment. And, you know, doing it also to be able to continue to spread my sacred work, right? To be able to, in my case, like, you know, teach people about how to connect with the cannabis plant in a way that is completely different, and a 180 difference from the way in which we're being touted to use cannabis, which is like, go for high THC, get fucked up. Yeah. It's like a rapper game and a music game and all that. And again, that's not necessarily bad. It's just that I think my message here is there's a different way, right? So use discernment and figure it out, right? Very similar for you. It's like there's vinyasa flow everywhere, right? And you're like, hey, that's cool. If you want to do that, that's awesome, right? There's also this other thing. Come try it out if it resonates, right? And I think that's like what I've been seeing with a lot of the messengers, I'll call them, right? The people that in this lifetime, maybe we've had many lifetimes where this hasn't been what we've done, right? But this lifetime is the one where we get to express that. I think that the best teachers, guides, et cetera, that I've spoken to are like, you don't have to do anything, right? These are just invitations. There's no rules here. There's no, you have to do this, right? There's just like, does this call to you? And if so, go into that. If not, keep on going, right? And I love that type of ideology. So Yogi, this has been amazing, man. I can't wait to have you back on for round 2. I don't even know how much deeper we'll get. If this was round 1, I can't wait for round 2. Where can people find you, man? Where can they find your podcast, your book, your upcoming book, all the stuff you got going? Where can the people find you, man? And I'll put it in the show notes too, but
yeah, so you can go to my website, zorananda.com. That's where you'll find my book. You can get it in ebook, paperback, hard copy. You can also find it on Amazon and I believe Goodreads. And I would say between one or the other, you're going to get it faster through Amazon. So if you don't want to wait through, and you'll pay less shipping, to be honest, in Amazon. So yeah, so you can find it on the Canadian site, I think a little bit faster. That's where, so zorananda.com has all my music, has my meditations. And then with social media right now, I'm predominantly using my yoga account. So Yogi Zorananda. Yeah, that's where I'm most active for sure. Yeah.
Beautiful, man. And I got one last question for you, man, that I ask everyone, right? And I'm really excited to see your answer on this too. So let's say someone listens to this episode and they're extremely excited to look into the idea of psychedelics in their own life. What is the one piece of advice you would suggest to them to allow them to use the proper discernment in choosing whether or not these medicines are right for them at this point in their lives?
Yeah, that is a great question. I like to err on the side where I don't like telling people outright that they should do a psychedelic. It came into my life, I think, pretty naturally. I think that's where I go towards. If you feel like you're being called to and you're confident that it's something that you can handle, I would say first and foremost, do as much research about it as possible. And so that can mean if there's any specific books that you want to get, if there's articles online, if there's research papers, the more you can learn about it, the better, so that you can have a good level of discernment on what kind of experience you want to have and the dosage that you want to do. Because between mushrooms, DMT, LSD, and getting into MDMA, which is not particularly psychoactive, but just engaging, like so incredibly engaging, that you'll want to know who to trust. I think that's a big thing. And especially now there's this whole wave of ayahuasca, right? It took me like 10 years before I even got to do my first ayahuasca, and I only did one, and I'm still like hesitant. Like I have a good friend who has been doing crazy amounts of training in Peru, and he knows how to make it and he has access to it. And so when it comes to the particular one, obviously mushrooms are most likely going to be the easiest, right? Where then it'll go into like acid. You might have a little bit of an ordeal trying to get a good quality one, and then DMT as well. But I would say if you're going to start anywhere, I would say start with mushrooms. 'Cause like you said earlier, you're going to have more control over your dosage, right? If you take 2 grams, you're taking 2 grams. And so at least then you can do research on the types as well, because then there's like gold caps and penis envy and albino cubensis, and they're all going to do different things, and they're all going to really engage with you differently. I find between the golden teachers and albino cubensis, the golden teachers I found for me personally were more like emotional processing. It's a lot of feeling. It's a lot of in the body. There's still the psychedelia, and there's still the waves and the movement in the mind, but it's more of a communication through feeling and showing you life patterns, where the albino cubensis was like very electric, very mind, very like sharp, geometric, and intense in that way. So then it's going to allow you to also have this new sense of education on yourself of who you are as a person, right? So if you feel like you are more of a feeling person, doing the golden teachers might be really helpful, right? Because it's going to get you into really tapping into your intuition. And then at that point, it's like, okay, if you're really a feeling person, maybe the albino cubensis would be helpful, because it's going to get you into more of your mind and more of like visualization. So yeah, that's where the last thing is, if it's your first time, being with someone you really trust and being with someone who can really hold space for that. Because the last thing you need is to go and do mushrooms at a party and freak out. Or to do mushrooms with someone who is really immature. And so you want to know that you're going to have a good time. It's supported, even if you're having a quote unquote bad trip, which is just stuff that's unprocessed, that's coming up, right? You want to be able to look at the person you're with and be like, I'm really fucked up and I need to just lay down. Cause that happened to me. I was with my friend that I first did mushrooms with, and I ended up throwing up, and I just laid down for 4 hours. And I was like, dude, I'm paralyzed. I can't move. I need to lay here, because if I even move my head, I get dizzy. And he's like, dude, just stay, whatever, right? I'm here. I'm going to do my thing. Just chill. And so it's good to know that you can go through whatever experience and there's support. So it's like support network. Huge.
Definitely. 100% agreed. Like, there have been many times where I've been so grateful that I'm around really good friends, because when you're in that vulnerable state, and especially like if you start to have a challenging experience too, and you have too much stimulation around you and you don't have a friend around that can help you out, that's when things actually get challenging, right? It's not really the challenge itself. It's not being able to vocalize it or be around people that can understand it. So yeah, man, 100% agreed. Guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I know you did. Thank you so much to Yogi for coming through. It's been amazing. If you guys like the show, please go give us a 5-star. It helps a lot. Otherwise, may the force be with each of you. Have the best day ever, and we will see you soon. Peace.